Okay, good morning, everybody. Hello and welcome to the IUCN Bear Specialist Group, North American Bears Expert Team webinar series. Chris Servine and I are the co-chairs of NABIT, and we certainly appreciate the continued involvement of NABIT members, as well as other BSG members from other expert teams participating on this call. Keep in mind that all the NABIT webinars that we've done to date are preserved on our YouTube website, and this link can be shared and passed on to anyone and everyone as an information resource. Today's webinar will also be placed after this presentation convenes and the recording is formatted. Chris and I also wanted to invite other NABIT committee members that have not yet presented a webinar to consider doing so by contacting us and getting in the queue to present. We've got about 25 NABIT members, and just about half have participated in the webinar series to date or in a panel discussion. So if you haven't yet presented, please contact Chris and I with a topic. We'd like to see all NABIT members contribute to the webinar series. We do have some other products that are in the works, which our members are participating in, and we definitely appreciate that, but we do hope you will engage in all these webinars, so thanks. Like always, we will finish today's webinar within 1 hour to respect everyone's time, and don't forget that you can use the chat to ask questions at any time, but Kerry will go ahead and answer questions at the conclusion of the presentation. Reminding everyone again to please mute your speakers so there's no interruptions. And let's get started with today's webinar. Today's panel discussion is titled "The Evolution of Bear Management in Yellowstone National Park and How and Why It's Been Successful" by Kerry Gunther. So Kerry, please take it away.
Okay. Can you see my screen?
Not yet.
Ah. Let's see. I have it up.
You hitting that right in this screen with all the people. There's a right in the center. There's a button called Share Screen. There's a little arrow there. Just go ahead and hit that arrow, that green arrow.
Oh, there we go.
There we go.
How about now?
It's coming, I think. There it is.
Okay. I'll get started here. So as most of you probably know, Yellowstone National Park, oops, it's not.
Are you in presenter view?
I believe so. Oh, there, can you see that?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, so Yellowstone National Park was established in 1872. It was set aside primarily to protect the geysers and thermal features, and bears and other wildlife really weren't one of the primary considerations when the park was established. Yellowstone National Park is 2.2 million acres, so pretty remarkable that they set aside such a large area back in 1872. Less than 1% of Yellowstone National Park has been altered by roads and developments. 92% of the park has been proposed for wilderness designation. And the park currently receives about 4.8 million visits per year. Most of that visitation occurs in that less than 1% of the park that's developed. We receive about 40 to 45,000 backcountry use nights. People camping in the backcountry. We don't monitor backcountry day use, but from some spot surveys I've done, day use, day hiking, day use recreation is about 10 to 15 times higher than overnight backcountry use. Pretty early in the park's history, log hotels were built at the geyser basins, so visitors could come stay in the park, tour the geyser basins. Now, garbage management was quite a bit different back then. The garbage from the hotel kitchens was just dumped right out back. As early as 1888, the park superintendent was reporting that large numbers of black bears had started to congregate at these garbage dumps behind the park hotels. And by the early 1890s, the superintendent was reporting that grizzly bears were now also frequenting the garbage piles behind the hotels. So it kind of became a tradition for visitors. They'd come stay at the hotel, tour the geyser basins during the day, and then come back to the hotel, have dinner, and then go out back in the evening to watch the grizzly bears and black bears feed on the hotel garbage that was just being dumped right out back behind the hotel. It became so popular with park visitors that the Park Service actually formalized the activity and created these, what they were called lunch counters for bears. And they would take the choicest barrels of kitchen scraps and dump it on a platform, and then have a ranger interpreter there. And then with log bleachers, people could sit and watch bears feed on garbage. And with several of these feeding stations throughout the park, about 2,000 people a night could watch bears feeding on garbage. Also, by the early 1890s, the superintendent was reporting that bears were starting to become very troublesome. They were getting conditioned to human foods and breaking into the hotel kitchens and the tent camps to get human food. And the superintendent at the time thought that he was probably going to have to remove some of the more aggressive bears to solve the problem. Now, in the early history of the park, all travel was by horse and wagon. We didn't get motorized vehicles officially allowed in the park until 1915. But as early as 1910, even before we had motorized vehicles, black bears had learned to panhandle for human food handouts along park roads. And this then quickly became a primary tourist attraction. Yellowstone Park became known as a place where you could see bears up close, you could feed bears, pet bears, use food to lure bears into interesting positions for photographs. And it was really pretty crazy times. Our campsites in developed areas also were not bear proof. And so on pretty much a nightly basis, both grizzly bears and black bears would come into the campgrounds and developed areas searching for, searching for human food and usurping campers' food right off the tables. Looking back at some of the records of these days, there's reports of bears coming in and just grabbing people's pet dogs out of the campgrounds. I found one report where a woman had a playpen set up with her infant baby in it, and a bear came in, just grabbed the baby out of the playpen and started to run off with it. And the woman ran after it screaming, and actually the bear dropped the infant and it wasn't injured too bad. But it just shows you how crazy things were in those days. The Park Service began keeping good records of bear-human conflicts in Yellowstone in 1931. And so we have good records from 1931 to the present time. From 1931 through 1969, we averaged 138 bear-caused property damages per year. And probably many of the more minor property damages went unreported. A lot of these damages were to tents, camping equipment, cabins, vehicles, those types. Also from 1931 through 1969, we averaged 48 bear-inflicted human injuries per year. A lot of these were relatively minor from people recreational hand-feeding bears, but even some of the not life-threatening injuries could cause some pretty good damage. I can't imagine with today's lawyers and lawsuits having 48 bear attacks in 1 year, but for quite a bit of the park's history, we were averaging that many every year. Now, early park managers realized that the high number of bear-human conflicts occurring in Yellowstone were due to these human food conditioned bears that were also habituated people, and then were interacting so closely with park visitors. But viewing bears was very popular, feeding of bears was very popular. And so the park made some efforts to try to reduce the number of conflicts, but never got real serious about it because it was such a popular tourist attraction. Then in 1967, in Glacier National Park, 2 people were killed by 2 different bears in 2 separate incidents in one night. And that was kind of a wake-up call for the National Park Service that we had to clean up the bear parks, because not only Yellowstone, and Glacier, but all the national parks that had bear populations were having a lot of bear-human conflicts, a lot of property damages, a lot of people getting hurt, and a lot of bears being killed in subsequent management actions. So Yellowstone National Park began writing a new bear management plan shortly after the glacier attacks. The new plan went into effect in 1970, but even prior to that, we had started to implement some of the management actions that were going to be contained in the new plan. So the 1970 management plan, the objectives were to continue to maintain viable populations of both grizzly bears and black bears in the park, but to return all bears to subsistence on the natural foods found in the park. And managers at the time believed that this would reduce the number of bear-caused property damages and reduce the number of bear-inflicted human injuries, which would then also reduce the number of bears that had to be killed in management actions due to conflicts. So as part of the program, Yellowstone National Park closed its garbage dumps. We closed 2 dumps in 1968, the year after the glacier attacks, the West Thumb dump and the Tower dump. And then we closed the Rabbit Creek dump, which was in the Old Faithful area in 1970, and the Trout Creek dump, which was in Hayden Valley in 1971. The Trout Creek dump is probably the most famous, as it had the largest aggregation of grizzly bears in the park. And that's the dump where the Craighead brothers were doing a lot of their research, although they did dump surveys of population estimates for grizzly bears at all the dumps in the park. The Trout Creek one is the most famous as it was the largest. Outside of Yellowstone National Park, the state of Montana also closed 3 garbage dumps, the West Yellowstone dump in West Yellowstone, Montana in 1970, the Gardner, Montana dump in 1978, and the Cook City dump in 1979. So all the major garbage dumps in the ecosystem were closed over a 12-year period. Also, as part of the 1970 management plan, the hand feeding of bears was strictly prohibited. We actually had laws on the books since 1902 prohibiting the recreational feeding of bears, but those regulations were never enforced, and the public pretty quickly learns what laws you enforce and which ones you don't. And so it was largely ignored, and the hand feeding went on up through the 1960s. We also converted all of our garbage cans and dumpsters to a bear-proof design so that bears wouldn't be getting garbage in our developed areas and campgrounds. Another big part of our program was converting our backcountry management from just dispersed camping, where you could camp anywhere you wanted in the backcountry, to a designated campsite system. And then as part of that, we put in a food storage device in every backcountry campsite in the park. We currently have 300 backcountry campsites, and we have food storage poles at 260 of those, and metal food storage lockers at 40 of those sites. And that really cleaned up our backcountry. So this shows a typical campground in Yellowstone National Park. You see the tents over to the right. The core camp is the tree kind of in the center where the fire ring is. Then over to the left, you can see the food bags hanging from the food pole. The tents are actually a little close to the core camp. They're supposed to be, we require that people set up their tents at least 100 yards away from the fire ring and the food storage pole. But you can see in this photo that the people are a little closer than that. And another thing this designated campsite system allowed us to do was monitor where people were. And then if we got reports of bear activity or carcasses near trails or campsites, it allows us to manage that. So we can close campsites and move people to other sites. We can close trails, or sometimes we move the carcasses. But we do a lot of day-to-day management of our backcountry visitors to reduce conflicts by closing campsites when needed, if there's carcasses or other bear attractants, natural foods near the campsites. We also do a lot of carcass management, just like on private lands outside the park, where they move a lot of cattle carcasses because of their attraction to bears. We do the same, but ours are large ungulate carcasses. So we move approximately 100 large ungulates per year. And these are primarily bison, moose, elk, and deer, because carcasses attract a lot of bears. So if something dies within a development or on the edge of a development or along a road, it's going to attract a lot of bears, which then can, those bears might get hit by a car, or just having hundreds of visitors watching a bear feed on a carcass next to the road will lead to habituation and possibly other problems. These are two bears fighting over a carcass that was about 10 yards off the road. And if we didn't move that carcass, we'd have visitors right there, 10, 20 yards from these bears as they were battling it out for control of the carcass. So carcass management is a real big part of our management program. We also, in the early 1980s, implemented what we call bear management areas. So we took the best backcountry bear habitat and we restrict recreational use in areas where there's concentrations of bears feeding on seasonal food. So about 21% of Yellowstone National Park is protected on a seasonal basis, where we either close it completely to recreational use over a period of weeks or months, or have other restrictions such as no off-trail travel, day use only type restrictions, that kind of thing. The objectives of these bear management areas are, first of all, to prevent displacement of bears from high quality food sources. Secondly, to reduce habituation of bears to people. And thirdly, to reduce the chances of bear inflicted human injuries at areas in the park where we have concentrations of bears. We also, in our backcountry campsites, in the 1970s, we started seeing an increase in people hitchhiking through the park or riding bicycles through the park. So we established hiker-biker campsites in our roadside car campgrounds and put in initially 16 cubic foot bear-proof food storage lockers for because bicyclists and hitchhikers couldn't store their food in a car because they didn't have one. And then you know, we never really had the problems like Yosemite with bears breaking into cars, because if a bear here started breaking into a car, we would remove that bear, kill it, euthanize it, so that we would stop that learning curve and it wouldn't be passed on to future generations. So we never really had big problems with bears breaking into vehicles. So initially in our roadside car campgrounds, you stored your food in your car. And if you're hiking or biking through the park, you stored it in a food storage locker. By the early 1990s, we were starting to see large commercial bike tours coming through the park. And so then we started putting these bear-proof food storage lockers into our large group campsites in our campgrounds. And then by the early 2000s, we started seeing a really big increase in the size of coolers. So initially we changed to, we were putting in 24 cubic foot food storage lockers. And then within just a few years, these giant Yeti coolers and stuff started coming out. So now we're redoing the whole park, putting in 30 cubic foot food storage lockers in all our campsites, both because of the size of the cooler. And then people have gotten lazy. So instead of just doing the hiker biker sites and the group loops, we're now putting a food storage locker in every campsite in every roadside campground in the park. So there was definitely some short-term negative consequences of our 1970 management program. First of all, initially, after the dump closures and the prohibiting of recreational feeding of bears, we had very high human-caused mortality, both inside the park and outside the park. We also saw lower cub production and survival. And the ultimate result was then that grizzly bears were listed as a threatened species in 1975. So many bears were removed both by management agencies in the park, as well as state agencies outside the park. And then there was a lot of DLP kills by private citizens as well. So from 1968 through 1979, which is the period of the dump closures, in Yellowstone National Park, we had 68 human-caused grizzly bear mortalities. A handful of those are road kills, but the rest are primarily management removals of conflict bears. Outside the park, in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, the state agencies had 179 grizzly bear mortalities by human causes. Again, a few of those were road kills. A lot of them were management removals. And then what a lot of people forget is that there was still a hunting season on grizzly bears through 1974. So some of those early years, the late 60s and the early 70s, a lot of those mortalities outside of the park were hunting kills. They were killing some years as many as about 24 grizzly bears during the grizzly bear hunt. So for the 12-year period that the dumps were closed, there was a total of 247 known grizzly bear mortalities from human causes. You'll see lots of different numbers. Some people when they look at the dump closures, they start at 1970. We could probably go a few years after 1979 because there's probably a lag effect of closing those dumps with a higher mortality for a few years after. But for the 12 years that the dumps were closed, there was 247 human-caused grizzly bear mortalities. We saw the age of first reproduction increase. We had taken out a lot of the older females that were food conditioned, and then bears without dumps to supplement the natural foods didn't put on weight as fast, and so the age of first reproduction increased. The interbirth interval also increased. There was more time in between litters, and then the mean litter size decreased. The decrease in litter size was probably not necessarily a nutritional thing, but by taking out a lot of the older females that were food conditioned, the average age of the population decreased, and younger females tended to have smaller litters, their first couple litters. The Craighead brothers had been doing all the research here in Yellowstone starting in 1959. And so for that period, just prior to the closing of the dumps, the Craighead brothers estimated that there was 222 to 245 grizzly bears in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, with most of those bears concentrated in Yellowstone National Park. They believed that the population was stable to slightly increasing, and that those bears were occupying a little over 15,000 square kilometers. By 1974, after the first several dumps were closed and the high mortality associated with that, the Craighead brothers estimated there was as few as 136 grizzly bears remaining in the GYE. And then the following year, 1975, grizzly bears were listed as a threatened species. On a long-term basis, I think everyone would agree that the 1970 program in the park was a pretty big success, despite those short-term negative consequences. We've definitely weaned bears off human foods and garbage. We'll now, in a typical year, maybe only have 2 or 3 incidents where grizzly bears get human food or garbage, which is pretty remarkable considering we have 4.8 million visitors. Cub production has increased again. In the last 29 years, I dug up the data, we've counted 690 grizzly bear cubs in the Yellowstone ecosystem. And during that same time period, we only had 25 human-caused mortalities of all age classes of grizzly bears, 13 management removals, 9 vehicle strike mortalities, and then 3 grizzlies that died of power line electrocution. This density estimate is coming from Frank Van Manen, Mark Harrelson, and the IGBST. This shows the highest density of bears is in Yellowstone National Park. And then the recovery zone outside of the park has the next highest density of bears. And then the demographic monitoring area currently has the lowest density of bears, but the bear population out in this purple area is still increasing, whereas it's kind of starting to flatline, maybe even slightly decrease in the park and the recovery zone as density dependent effects start impacting the population. Looking at conflicts, this graph again shows bear-human conflicts from the late 60s through the present. You can see we've drastically decreased the number of bear-human conflicts occurring in the park, even though visitation, we set a new record visitation every decade in the park. So despite increasing visitation, conflicts are declining. There was this little, by 1979, the biologists in the park believed that there was really no highly food conditioned bears left in the park. But then in the 1980s, we actually saw a little bit of increase in conflicts. The 1980s, that's when Dick Knight and Lee Eberhardt did some modeling on the population and believed in the early to mid 1980s that the survival of just 1 or 2 extra adult female bears was critical to conservation of the species. That the loss of just 1 or 2 adult females could send the population into a downward spiral. So because of that, we were much more lenient with conflict bears in the 1980s. And we, I believe we moved right around 50 problem bears. Instead of removing them from the population, we relocated them and they caused additional conflict. So we had a little bit of an increase in the 1980s. But then in the 1990s, our population in the park anyway, our counts of females with cubs pretty much stabilized. We believed we were at recovery in the park in the 90s. And so then we got pretty aggressive about removing conflict bears rather than relocating them. And we've had pretty low numbers of human-bear conflicts ever since. Looking at the number of injuries per million visitors, kind of a per capita basis, you can see since 2010 now we're at the lowest number of injuries in the history of the park since we've kept record. So sometimes people are saying that bears are becoming more aggressive and injuring more people because of the decline of some major foods, but we're really not seeing that in the park. Again, we're at our lowest level on a per capita basis of injuries that we've ever had. Looking at human-caused bear mortalities, again, in the 50s and 60s and 70s, almost all of our mortality in Yellowstone National Park was due to human causes. But from the 1980s on, about half or more of our mortality is now natural causes. So bears are actually living out their lives and dying of old age and other natural causes for the last couple decades. So we now have more grizzlies in the GYA. Some of the IGBST estimates are as high as a little over 1,000 grizzly bears in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem compared to 245 when the dumps were open. And bears are occupying a much larger area, over 70,000 square kilometers compared to 15,000 square kilometers during the dump days. We're seeing some new problems in Yellowstone now. Just when you think you have all your problems solved, something new surfaces. So we've kind of solved our problems with bears getting human foods and garbage. But what happens if you have low mortality in a lot of people is bears habituate to the presence of people. So this is our biggest management challenge today. People do a lot of stupid things to get pictures. This woman could have easily taken her picture from in her car, but she had to get out with the bear. And in Yellowstone, again, we get these huge jams with hundreds of people just watching a bear feed in a meadow next to the road. Initially, we would capture and move those bears. That didn't really work. The Yellowstone Park's not big enough where a bear can't just come back to its original home range. Then we tried heavy aversive conditioning, and pretty much what we found is the bears learned our uniforms, they learned our vehicles, they learned the gun. And it's very hard to teach a bear to avoid acres of good habitat next to a road. That the food drive overwhelms the aversive conditioning mode. So we didn't have a whole lot of luck trying to teach bears to stay out of roadside meadows. So finally, we settled on managing the people instead of trying to managing the bear. You can see there's 3 rangers in this picture managing this crowd of people, trying to keep people from approaching the bears or throwing food to the bears. Or following the bears into the woods, but it's very time consuming. We now get 500 to 1,000 bear jams per year. We're spending 2,500 to 3,500 staff hours per year managing people at bear jams. And with the increase in visitation and the number of bear jams, we used to be able to manage about 85 to 95% of the jams. Now we only have staff present at about 75 to 80% of the bear jams. And it's just going to get tougher in the future to continue this. So it's worked very well. The public loves watching the bears along the road, but I'm not sure that we can sustain it from a staff and budget perspective, allowing these habituated bears to use the roadways. So that'll be one of our tough decisions in the future. Just what are we going to do with these habituated bears? They're not food conditioned. They don't cause any problems other than huge traffic jams. Visitation in the park has been going crazy the last decade. Last year was a record year for visitation, 4.86 million. We had a couple COVID years prior to that where visitation was down a little bit, but almost every year in the last 10 years was a new record for visitation. So one thing we need to develop more effective methods to promote proper bear viewing etiquette in the park, because we can't afford to have staff at every bear jam anymore like we haven't had in the past. So in summary, our current management program has been very successful at reducing conflicts. We have, like I said, less than half a dozen grizzly bear human conflicts every year now. And our program consists primarily of, first of all, we try to provide visitors with information on how to hike, camp, recreate, and store anthropogenic attractants in a manner that reduces the chances of bear-human conflicts in the park. And then secondly, we try to provide park visitors with bear-proof infrastructure, bear-proof garbage cans, dumpsters, and food storage devices so that our food and garbage storage regulations are easy and convenient to comply with. What we find is if we make it easier for visitors, they do it. And if it's hard for visitors to comply with food storage orders, they just won't do it. They're too lazy. Thirdly, we're rigorously enforcing our food and garbage storage regulations. We found that if you have regulations on the books, but don't enforce them, the public figures that out pretty quick. And so we are continuing with evening food security patrols in our developed areas, campgrounds, and we're also doing backcountry campsite monitoring as well with backcountry rangers. And then the last part of our program, which is a smaller component, but I think very important, is that we try to foster, through the removal of human food condition bears, a population of bears in the park that don't seek anthropogenic attractants. And so it always amazes me in Yellowstone, on any given night, you can find a bear-proof dumpster with a broken latch, or a campsite here or there in a roadside campground where somebody's left a cooler out, or even in a backcountry campsite, somebody not hanging their food properly. But by removing food conditioned bears, the females don't teach that to their cubs. And so we've kind of brought the Yellowstone population back from probably the worst food conditioned bears you'd see in the world, to bears now that don't really seek human foods and garbage at all. And so even though we're probably only 80 or 85% bear proof, our bears just don't look for that stuff, and so rarely ever even get into it. I think that's a pretty important part of our management program. Now, initially, when we were recovering the population, those bears, we needed to move some bears just to try to bring the population back. But now that we have a recovered population, we've been a lot more aggressive about removing bears, and it really has cleaned up our conflicts in the park. Okay, I could answer any questions.
Well, we've got one in the chat so far here, Kerry. Can you see it?
Yes. So the question is, are you seeing the same types of trends, mortalities, population conflicts with black bears? And the answer to that is yes. We have very few black bear conflicts as well. Most of our research time and effort and budget goes into grizzly bears because they're a threatened species, but we're seeing the same types of trends with black bears. We have very few conflicts with black bears. And we've done some hair snare type stuff we have a pretty good density of black bears, at least on the northern third of the park where we've done the research.
Good, Sterling.
Yeah, a very good job, Kerry. I was surprised that you didn't mention this book that you co-edited on Yellowstone grizzly bears, ecology conservation of an icon of wilderness. And, you know, people who aren't aware of this book, I recommend it. I also have a question. I just wonder if you comment briefly on the differences between Yellowstone Park management of grizzly bears and that in Glacier.
I think Glacier and Yellowstone are pretty closely matched as far as how we manage bear proofing stuff and food conditioned bears. We're a little different with habituated bears. In Yellowstone, we chose to tolerate habituation along roads, where in Glacier, they're less tolerant of it. Yellowstone, we have these big meadows and valleys where sometimes you can be a couple miles from the nearest tree. Glacier, they can just haze a bear, usually just 30 yards or so, and it's in the forest and out of view, where we would have to haze a bear miles. I have to admit, our program, I never felt good about removing habituated bears because they weren't causing conflicts. It was really the tourists causing the problem by how they parked and approached bears. Those bears weren't getting conditioned to human foods, weren't damaging property. And I felt really guilty removing them, killing them. So that's how we went to this management. I'm not sure of all the decisions I've made in my career. I'm still not sure that was the right decision, just with hundreds of jams and how many hours we spend doing it. I'm not sure it's sustainable into the future. And in 50 years, I'm worried somebody is going to look back and think Gunther was crazy for tolerating those habituated bears like that. So I don't know, maybe Glacier has the right answer. Maybe we're doing it right, but it's a real tough thing to do. And it takes probably 80% of our management time is spent just on habituated bears. There's another question here on what's the threshold for a food conditioned bear? So what we do, if the bear aggressively goes after food and damages property or injures somebody to get it, we remove the bear, even if it's the first strike. If a bear stumbles on something where it was human error, just left sitting out, we'll leave the bear out on the landscape. So it's the bear's intention. If the bear intentionally goes after something, we take that bear out. That's the threshold we use. Another question here, do you see any hotspot of bear jam? Yeah, we definitely have a few places. The tower area is a hotspot for black bear jams. The East Entrance Road is a hotspot for grizzly bear jams. We have a female that's raised now a couple litters of cubs on the East Entrance Road. She's highly habituated and she produces cubs that are highly habituated. Yeah, we definitely have some hotspots for that. Let's see. And I guess that's the same question, is bear jam sporadic or occurs at several specific places? Most of our bear jams are either subadults or a lot of them are females. When they have cubs of the year, sometimes when they have yearlings or 2-year-olds or they're barren, they don't cause jams at all, but they seem to maybe be using the people along the road as a human shield. And there's definitely specific places where females have home ranges that include roadsides where we get bear jams on a regular basis. You can just predict it during certain seasons and times of the day.
Like Garth's got a question. Go ahead, Garth.
Yeah, hi, Kerry. I'm wondering about managing these bear jams, and not that we have anything like you have in BC. I mean, your numbers are astounding, frankly. I mean, to have 1,000 of them in 1 year is a lot. But what about managing this place? Like if you had 1 kilometer or 2 kilometers where you say no vehicles may stop here, and then you have a stopping spot or something like that, where you're not managing these sort of spontaneous bear jams, but you're actually trying to manage the space. And I guess the bears will then know that at some point, sort of like you do on a bear viewing stream, on a salmon stream, where you set boundaries. Some places even draw white lines and stuff. Do you think that might be somewhere where you go in the future?
Yeah, and we've been using temporary no stopping zones in places where there's no pullouts and tight curves. And we've discussed just what you're saying there, maybe having a couple areas where we allow bear viewing of habituated bears and then have other areas where we just don't allow it, just to reduce the amount of staff time. So those are great ideas and we've discussed them. One of the problems after we kind of started allowing habituated bears along the road, slowly at first, but in 1990. And so now after, 30 some years, almost 40 years, 30 years, there's such a constituency of people that like bear jams. They are very loud when we try to change management. And with social media being used as a weapon, we really get we've kind of painted ourselves in a corner where it's going to be a tough fight. It's going to be as tough, I think, as closing the dumps, closing down the bear jams, just because it's that popular with the public.
I love
we have bears now that people start web pages, Facebook pages for bears and stuff. It's really crazy.
I love your analogy that social media is a weapon. Thanks, Kerry.
Okay, so Dave has a question. How do we keep track of individual bears that may be habituated? We purposely try not to radio collar those bears or ear tag them because the public goes nuts. But some of them, they just show up in the same spot day after day, year after year. And so with different scars and markings, you can be fairly certain it's the same bear a lot of the time, but you can't be 100% sure. And these photographers a lot of times think they're identifying the same bear and it's really a different bear. 1 year, I removed a bear called Blaze that the photographer said had been there for like 22 years. And then when we got the tooth back, Blaze was only 12 years old. So I think in that case, there had been a couple bears that looked very much alike, maybe even offspring of the original Blaze, but Blaze was probably 2 or 3 different bears over a long time period that they just thought was one bear. Next question here is, when you decide to kill a bear, again, for us, we implement pretty much a 1-strike policy if the bear aggressively goes after human food. If it's relatively benign, or the bear goes after something but doesn't get into it, then we'll leave it be as well. So last year we had a bear tore our plastics recycling bin completely out of the ground, bent it all up, but didn't get it open, so it didn't get a food reward. So in that case, then we just hung out there for a period, hit it with rubber bullets and bean bags if it came back. It didn't get a food reward and it never came back. So in a case like that, we left the bear be. But if the bear gets a food reward and is aggressive about it, that's our line in the sand. Another question from Michael Proctor. In many countries, there's not a strong desire to kill. In many countries, there is a strong desire to not kill conflict bears. What might your program have looked like if you couldn't kill some bears? I think we would have a lot more conflicts today if we didn't switch over. Now, I think in every population, when they're threatened, you got to give them a lot more chances. But once you reach that period of recovery, I think you're way better off removing a problem bear, because if you have fewer conflicts, it's just less strain on your life and your budget and your staff. If you have fewer conflicts, people are more supportive of bear conservation and protecting habitat, because they're not dealing with a bear coming in and damaging their property or injuring people. So I think over time you got to work at really reducing conflicts, and you got to be happy and proud of your efforts to reduce conflict. So in Yellowstone, we've gone to huge lengths to reduce conflicts, and because we're happy with our effort, then it doesn't bother as much to kill bears. We don't like to kill bears. None of us get into this business to kill bears. I've gotten hate mail from all over the world. I've even gotten a few death threats. But I think in a long-term program, if you can knock that learning out of the system, those females are just going to teach their cubs those same bad habits. So eventually, I think you got to flip the switch and try to foster a population of bears that doesn't even seek that stuff. And that will allow you to be 70 or 80% bear proof instead of having to be 100% bear proof. Because you can never reach 100% bear proof. I'm convinced of that.
See that one question above Michael's there, Kerry?
Let me see here. Okay, the question is, there are always people who are willing to attract wild animals near tourists in order to attract tourists and improve the local economy. I don't like this behavior, but there seems to be no good way to stop it. What do you think? Yeah, in Yellowstone Park, we don't allow people to feed bears. And so our bears are choosing to be near the road because of good habitat or to avoid other bears. We have created a situation now where we did a study about 10 years ago where bear viewing was contributing about $10 million to the gateway communities from bear viewing businesses. So it's kind of bad that way, in that if we ever try to change what we're doing, we will affect those businesses, and our congressman will hear about that. So yeah, I hate to put a money value on bears because there are some negatives, but there's also some positives. A lot of the locals around here didn't like bears, but now that they're making money off bears, they like them a lot more. So there's both positive and negatives to the tourism side of bears and bear viewing.
Okay, folks, if anyone out there have any last questions, we still have, about 10 minutes here. If not, we'll go ahead and wrap it up. So I'll give it another minute, but.
Yeah, and thank you, Sterling, for plugging the book.
Yeah. There's Brian. Go ahead, Brian.
Yeah, this isn't so much of a question, so I waited to the end, but watching those photographs of the horse-drawn carriages through a big pile of grizzly bears at a dump made me think those are pretty brave bears. Did they have a lot of problems with horses back then?
You know, horses can get, Harrelson would be a better one for this question, but horses can get pretty used to bears if you interact with bears enough with horses. And so, and back then, I think like horses were probably tougher back then than they are now, but just like people were probably tougher back then. But no, I think the rangers that always were at that dump show, you know, the bears just would get used to the bears over time and really didn't cause many problems.
Yeah, with all the food at the dump, there's no reason to chase after a horse, I suppose.
Yeah, why waste the energy when there's a lot of calories just laying there on the ground?
Yeah, fascinating.
Got one in the chat there, Kerry.
Okay, yeah. So another one from Dave. Has anyone surveyed Yellowstone National Park visitors to see what percent come primarily to see wildlife, especially bears, comparing the old days and now? Yeah, we've done a number of social surveys, and it used to always be that geysers and thermal features were the primary reasons that people came here. But bears and wolves are now about equal to geysers and thermal features. So, and even some surveys have now shown that bears and wolves are more popular than geysers and thermal features. We had one woman said, just stay home, boil some water at home, you'll save a lot of money. She was bored with our thermal features. But yeah, so bears and wildlife, bears, wolves, and moose are our three most popular wildlife species that visitors come here to see. And Yellowstone is, you know, fantastic wildlife viewing. And a lot of people now come here just for that. Just as many come to see wildlife as come to see geysers.
Yep, Jay Wilder there, go ahead. There you are.
Hi. Thanks, Kerry. Jim Wilder. I'm on the Bridger Teton National Forest just south of Yellowstone. Kerry had talked about bear jams and, you know, the social media following of individual bears and death threats and all this, which resonates with stuff we're seeing on the Bridger Teton. As you know, Yellowstone's kind of unique in that you guys have all encompassing authority to manage people and bears. You're familiar with bear viewing on the Bridger Teton, specifically Togety Pass. You know, for those who aren't familiar, that's a major highway through the Bridger Teton National Forest. There's bears now that feed along the highway and cause major human safety issues, both from traffic and bears, and it's multi-jurisdictional. It's Wyoming Highway Patrol, Wyoming Department of Transportation, Forest Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, Wyoming Game and Fish Department. Anyway, long-winded lead into a question. I know you're familiar with this specific situation. I was just curious if you had advice for a fellow agency on your borders that don't have the same authority that you do to manage bears and people to handle a situation like that. You know, considering all the social media following, the passion, the death threats, I mean, it's all the same down here too.
Yeah, like first of all, I'd like to say, you know, Yellowstone, our data, you know, really shows how we were able to clean it up. But a national park is the easiest place in the world to do that because a superintendent is like a king. He can just make regulations. And so it's way easier than dealing with private land or Forest Service land with in multi-jurisdiction, that kind of stuff. With I don't see how you could have bear jams like we have in Yellowstone Park on a major highway like that on Togety Pass. Yellowstone, most of our roads are 45 miles per hour is the fastest road in the park, other than Highway 191, which cuts through the corner on the west side. Most of our roads are 35 miles per hour, so it's a lot easier to deal with. So I think just like what Garth was saying, you got to kind of pick and choose where you're going to allow to habituated bears and roadside viewing if you want that. And with Togety Pass, I don't see how you could do it safely for a long period of time. And like Teton is such a smaller park than Yellowstone. So our habituated bears, at least so far, very few of them end up outside the park. But in Grand Teton, when you have a highly habituated bear, there's a real good chance that half that bear's home range is going to be outside the park, where things are very different. And so you got to manage for the cards you're dealt. And so I think outside the park, there's probably very few places where you could have the staff and the road safety and stuff to try to manage roadside bear viewing like we do in the park. So I think you just have to, in some cases, remove those bears. We've thumped the heck out of them with aversive conditioning, and you can't teach a bear to avoid food. And you have acres and acres of good food along some of these roads, so you're not going to teach the bear to stay out of there. And if you have to remove bears, it's way better to do it early in the habituation process than when the bear has a huge following. Like 399 is going to be, I think she needs to be removed, and it's going to be a huge public outcry when she is removed. And so in areas where you can't manage it the way we are, it'd be better to maybe remove those bears quicker. Grand Teton National Park has done a huge effort to try to save those bears, and it worked for a lot of years, but now as she's getting older, she's just getting into more and more conflicts. And even in Yellowstone National Park, I'm still not sure that we're doing the right thing, trying this roadside bear viewing stuff. And in 50 years, people will probably be just thinking I was crazy to even try it. But we're a big enough park, 2.2 million acres, where our bears spend the majority of their time in the park, at least a lot of our bears. So I think we can do some things here that you just can't do outside of a national park.
Yeah, I agree with everything you said. The problem is there's no institutional stomach for removing bears along the roadside, but
no, and it's a hard thing to do because they really haven't done anything wrong. Well, 399 now has gotten into all kinds of stuff, but most of these bears, for most of their lives, they don't do anything wrong, and so you feel really bad. I know I do, killing a bear just because it's learned to get along with people. But McNeil River and even Katmai, they're dealing with much lower numbers of visitors than we are. So like in Yellowstone, sometimes our bear jams are kind of like McNeil River on steroids. They have a limit of 10 people at McNeil River. We could have easily 200 people at a bear jam in Yellowstone Park. So it can get pretty crazy pretty fast.
Well, Dan, if you can bring us home here with your question.
Yeah, Jim kind of stole that one. I didn't know he was on there, but that was perfect. Jim had the same kind of comment, and that's exactly what we're running into here. Is that even if you put no stopping signs on each end of Togety Pass, people see a grizzly bear off the side of the road, they're going to stop. There's no way you can keep them from doing that. Highway Patrol doesn't have any stomach to write tickets for that kind of thing, and so. Yeah, it's really difficult, and we've struggled with, do you move them? Do you remove them? The people love those roadside bears, and so they're going to beat you up pretty hard for any of that kind of thing. So.
Yeah, and some of these people, like, it's an addiction almost. Like, if you haven't experienced it, like if you meet some of these people, it is truly an addiction. I think they would be in Vegas losing all their money if they didn't have roadside bear jams.
Yeah, they seek it out.
Yeah. And as somebody, I've like Blaze was supposedly a roadside bear. And for 3 months, maybe trickling into a 4th month a little bit, I got hundreds of letters and emails and phone calls. But then it kind of wanes and goes away. So you just got to put up with the attack for a few months, and then it's over. And And like with 399, I think she's done enough where I would have removed her by now. But I understand how hard it is because they've put so much effort in trying to keep her alive. And you feel bad for the bear, and none of us want to kill bears, but I think to foster a population that does what you want, you have to remove the ones that are doing what you don't want.
Well, Kerry, I want to say thanks a bunch on behalf of Chris and I, and of course, Nabbit and all the BSG folks that are on board. Thanks for the presentation and the overview. It was great. And thanks for everyone for attending, and we will be in touch soon. This talk will be online here later today. So thanks again, everybody.
Yep. Thanks everybody for showing up.
Thanks.
Eric.